Sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't death. It's being left alive when everyone you love has already buried you in their hearts. In 1883, Beatrice Fulton learned this truth when her frontier town decided her barren womb made her a curse upon the land. They buried her up to her neck in the desert, leaving her to die under the burning sun. Her husband walked away without a backward glance. For 2 days, she waited for the end. Then, Nathaniel Cross rode by. The wealthy rancher had lost his own wife and child years before. When he saw Beatrice's head rising from the sand like a forgotten grave marker, something stirred in his chest. He dug her out with his bare hands and wrapped her in his coat. 2 broken people, both abandoned by fate, now faced an impossible question together. Could love really grow in such barren ground? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Cross Ranch spread across the valley like a promise of prosperity carved from stubborn earth. Nathaniel guided his horse carefully, the unconscious woman wrapped in his coat and cradled against his chest. Her breathing came shallow and quick, her sun-burned face peaceful in exhaustion. The simple gold band on her finger caught the late afternoon light, a wedding ring that told its own story of abandonment and broken vows. His stallion's hooves drummed a steady rhythm across the packed dirt that led to the ranch house, a 2-story structure built from native stone and timber hauled from the mountains. Unlike most frontier homes that squatted low against the wind, Nathaniel had built upward, creating something that spoke of permanence and hope. Wide porches wrapped around the first floor, offering shade and shelter from the harsh weather that swept across the plains. The second floor boasted real glass windows, a luxury that had cost him dearly, but reminded him daily that he'd succeeded where others had failed. As he approached the house, Diego Morales emerged from the barn, his weathered hands stilling on the bridle he'd been mending. The foreman had worked for Nathaniel since the early days, back when the ranch consisted of little more than a cabin and 100 head of cattle. Now, 3 years after Margaret's death, Diego had become more than an employee. He was the closest thing to family Nathaniel had left. "¿Qué pasó, patron?" Diego's dark eyes took in the woman's condition with the quick assessment of a man who'd seen his share of trouble. He moved toward them without waiting for an answer. His weathered face creasing with concern, found her buried in the sand 2 days out by Devil's Creek. Nathaniel's voice carried the weight of what he'd witnessed, the cruelty of desperate people and the thin line between civilization and barbarity. "Help me get her inside. We'll need Mrs. Patterson." Diego nodded, reaching up to help support the woman as Nathaniel dismounted. Together they carried her toward the house, her head lolling against Nathaniel's shoulder. The foreman's silence spoke volumes. He'd asked no questions until the woman was safe and tended. The interior of the ranch house reflected Nathaniel's success in ways that might have seemed ostentatious in town, but felt earned here in the wilderness. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes hung on plastered walls. A grandfather clock, shipped by rail from St. Louis, marked time in the front hallway with measured dignity. These weren't the trappings of a man trying to impress. They were the choices of someone who'd learned that beauty mattered, especially in a world that often forgot such things existed. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the top of the stairs, her grey hair pinned back severely, but her blue eyes warm with concern. She'd been Margaret's companion before becoming the ranch housekeeper, and grief had forged an unspoken understanding between her and Nathaniel. She took in the scene below with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd weathered many crises. "Guest room's ready," she called down, already moving toward the prepared space. "I'll get the basin and salts." They carried Beatrice up the carpeted stairs, past the closed door of Margaret's room, still untouched after 3 years, and into the guest chamber. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, illuminating a 4-poster bed with a hand-sewn quilt and matching drapes. Fresh flowers from Mrs. Patterson's garden sat in a crystal vase on the nightstand. their fragrance mixing with the scent of lavender sachets tucked between the linens. As they laid her on the bed, Beatrice's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. The papered walls, the mahogany furniture, the luxury she'd never known. Then memory returned, and with it a wariness that spoke of hard-learned lessons about trusting strangers. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper, raw from thirst and exposure. "You're safe." Nathaniel stepped back, giving her space, while Mrs. Patterson bustled around the room with water and clean cloths. "This is my ranch." The Cross spread, about 20 miles southwest of Dustwater. At the mention of the town name, something shifted in her expression. Not fear exactly, but resignation, the look of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from human nature. Mrs. Patterson approached the bed with gentle authority, her movements deliberate and soothing. "Let's get you cleaned up and properly hydrated, dear. You've been through quite an ordeal." Over the next hour, while Mrs. Patterson tended to Beatrice's immediate needs, Nathaniel found himself pacing the downstairs rooms like a caged animal. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed louder than usual, marking time he spent wrestling with memories he'd tried to bury as deep as his wife and son. He'd met Margaret Whitfield at a church social in Kansas City, back when he was just another young man with dreams bigger than his circumstances. She'd been visiting her aunt for the summer, all golden hair and gentle laughter, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of a woman raised in modest but loving circumstances. Their courtship had unfolded through letters after she returned. East, each exchange building toward the inevitable decision that brought her west to become his wife. The early years had been everything he'd hoped for. Margaret had thrown herself into ranch life with enthusiasm that matched his own, learning to manage the household while he built the business. They'd planned for children, prepared nurseries, chosen names for sons and daughters who never came. Month after month, year after year, they'd watched hope dim without ever quite dying. The fever had taken them both, Margaret and their stillborn son, in the space of 3 awful days. Nathaniel had buried them on a hill overlooking the valley, beneath cottonwood trees that provided shade and the sound of rustling leaves in the endless wind. For months afterward, he'd existed rather than lived, going through the motions of running the ranch while feeling as buried as the woman he'd found in the sand. Now, unexpectedly, he found himself responsible for another soul, someone who understood loss in ways that didn't require explanation. Mrs. Patterson's footsteps on the stairs drew him from his brooding. She descended with purposeful quiet, carrying a basin of used water and bloodied cloths. "She's resting now," she reported, settling into the kitchen to prepare a light meal. "Poor thing's been through hell and back, dehydrated, sunburned, half-starved. But she's strong. I can see it in her eyes." "Did she say anything about what happened, about how she ended up buried out there?" Mrs. Patterson's mouth tightened with disapproval. "Enough. Her husband divorced her for being barren, and the town decided she was cursed, buried her neck deep and left her to die." She turned to face him fully, her expression fierce with protective anger. "What kind of people do such things?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, though Nathaniel knew it wasn't directed at him. Still, he felt the weight of collective human cruelty, the knowledge that civilization was often just a thin veneer over darker impulses. "The frightened kind," he answered finally. "People who need someone to blame for their own troubles." That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the valley and the first stars appeared in the vast sky, Nathaniel sat on his front porch with a glass of whiskey and the account books that tracked his growing prosperity. The railroad stocks alone had made him wealthy beyond the dreams of most frontier settlers, but success felt hollow without someone to share it. Through the open windows above, he could hear Mrs. Patterson moving around the guest room, tending to their unexpected visitor. Diego had spread word among the ranch hands that they had a guest recovering from illness. No details, just enough to ensure privacy and respectful behavior. Tommy Reeves, barely 18 and eager as a new colt, had volunteered to take the night watch, partly from duty and partly from curiosity about the mysterious woman who'd arrived wrapped in the boss's coat. The other hands, seasoned men who'd learned not to ask too many questions, simply nodded their acceptance and went about their business. In a land where privacy was both precious and respected, they understood that some stories revealed themselves in their own time. As the night deepened and the whiskey warmed his chest, Nathaniel found himself thinking about second chances. He'd built this ranch as a monument to his dreams with Margaret, but perhaps it could serve another purpose now. Perhaps it could be a place where broken people could heal, where the past didn't have to dictate the future. The thought both excited and terrified him. He'd grown comfortable with his solitude, even if it was sometimes lonely. Taking responsibility for another person, especially one who'd been so cruelly betrayed, meant risking the kind of pain he wasn't sure he could survive. Again, but as he remembered the dignity in her eyes, even as she faced death, he realized the choice might already be made. Some encounters changed the fundamental direction of a life, and he suspected this was one of them. Inside the house, the grandfather clock chimed midnight, its deep tones carrying across the valley toward distant mountains that stood like silent sentinels against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the guest room above, a woman who'd been left for dead slept in safety for the first time in years, her simple wedding ring catching moonlight as she dreamed of possibilities she'd thought were buried forever in the sand. 3 days of careful tending had brought color back to Beatrice's cheeks and strength to her voice. She sat in the guest room's cushioned chair, wearing one of Margaret's dresses that Mrs. Patterson had altered to fit her smaller frame. The pale blue cotton complemented her dark hair, which had been washed and braided simply. For the first time since Nathaniel had found her, she looked like a woman rather than a victim of circumstance. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention from the morning ledgers spread across his desk. Through the study window, he watched a small group of riders approach the ranch house with purpose that immediately put him on edge. Sheriff Coleman rode at the front, his badge catching the morning sun, but it was the man beside him that made Nathaniel's jaw tighten with instinctive dislike. Henry Fulton sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man who'd convinced himself that righteous anger justified any action. His narrow face bore the permanent scowl of someone perpetually dissatisfied with the world's refusal to bend to his will. Behind him rode 2 other men from Dustwater, merchants who'd thrown their lot in with whatever promised to maintain their standing in the community. Nathaniel rose from his desk and walked to the front porch, Diego appearing at his shoulder as if summoned by some unspoken signal. The foreman's hand rested casually near the pistol at his hip, though his expression remained neutral. "Morning." "Sheriff," Nathaniel called as the riders drew rein near the porch steps. "What brings you all the way out here?" Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly caught between duty and personal inclination. He was a decent man trying to navigate impossible circumstances, and Nathaniel could see the conflict written plain on his weathered features. "Morning, Nathaniel. I'm afraid this is official business." Coleman's voice carried apologetic undertones that didn't extend to the man beside him. "Henry Fulton here claims you're harboring his wife illegally." "Ex-wife," Henry corrected sharply, his voice carrying the bitter satisfaction of a man who'd found legal grounds for his cruelty. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, waving it like a weapon. "Got the divorce papers right here, signed and witnessed. Beatrice Fulton is no longer my concern, but she owes me compensation for 5 wasted years." Nathaniel kept his expression carefully neutral, though fury burned in his chest like a banked fire. "Compensation for what exactly? Food, shelter, clothing, 5 years of supporting a barren woman who couldn't fulfill her basic duties as a wife." Henry's words dripped with self-righteousness that made Diego's hand shift slightly closer to his weapon. The law says a man's entitled to recompense for breach of marital contract. The law also says you can't bury people in the desert and leave them to die, Nathaniel replied quietly, his tone carrying more menace than any shout could have managed. Henry's face flushed red above his scraggly beard. That wasn't my doing. The town decided she was cursed, bringing bad luck to the whole community. Crops failing, cattle dying, children getting sick, all because of her barren womb poisoning the very ground. Superstitious nonsense from frightened people. Maybe so, but the fact remains, she owes me. Henry straightened in his saddle, trying to project authority he'd never actually possessed. I want $500 compensation, or I want her back to work off the debt. The number hung in the air like a challenge. $500 represented months of wages for most men, a sum calculated to be either impossible to pay or ruinous in its cost. But Henry had badly miscalculated his target. Nathaniel's railroad investments alone earned more than that in a month. "Sheriff," Nathaniel said without taking his eyes off Henry, "what does the law actually say about this situation?" Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, technically speaking, if there was a breach of marital contract, and if financial damages could be proven." He trailed off, clearly unhappy with the legal precedent he was forced to uphold. From the upstairs window, movement caught Nathaniel's eye. Beatrice stood behind the curtains, her face pale but resolute as she watched the confrontation unfold. Even from a distance, he could see the resignation in her posture, the expectation that she would once again be traded like property between men who saw her only as a burden or an asset. That sight decided him. $500, Nathaniel said calmly, reaching into his vest pocket for his wallet. He counted out the bills with deliberate precision, each crisp note a small act of defiance against the cruel arithmetic of Henry's greed. "There's your compensation, Fulton. Now get off my land." Henry's eyes widened with surprise and avarice as he reached for the money. "Well, now, that's more like it, though I suppose interest might be—" "The money comes with conditions," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice carrying the steel of absolute conviction. "You take this payment, and you never come near her again. You don't speak her name. You don't inquire after her welfare. You don't acknowledge her existence if you pass her on the street. As far as you're concerned, Beatrice Fulton died in that desert where you left her. Now see here, Cross. Furthermore," Nathaniel continued, stepping down from the porch with measured steps, "if I hear of you spreading stories about her or trying to cause her any trouble whatsoever, I'll make it my personal mission to ensure every business in this territory knows exactly what kind of man you are. Your credit will dry up, your suppliers will find other customers, and you'll discover just how quickly prosperity can turn to poverty when the right words reach the right ears." Henry's face cycled through several emotions before settling on sullen acceptance. He was a small man in every way that mattered, and when faced with someone willing to fight, he inevitably folded. He snatched the money from Nathaniel's outstretched hand and stuffed it into his coat pocket. "This ain't over," he muttered, but the words carried no real conviction. "Yes, it is." Nathaniel's tone brooked no argument. "Sheriff, I trust you'll make sure Mr. Fulton understands the legal implications of harassment or trespassing on private property." Coleman nodded gratefully, clearly relieved to have the matter settled without violence. "I'll make sure everyone understands the situation. You bought yourself some peace, Nathaniel, but you should know, folks in town aren't going to take kindly to this. They're already calling it unnatural, a wealthy man taking in a cursed woman." "Let them talk," Nathaniel replied. "I've never much cared for the opinions of people who bury helpless women in the sand." As the riders turned to leave, Henry twisted in his saddle for one final shot. "You'll regret this, Cross. That woman brings nothing but misery to any man fool enough to shelter her. Mark my words, you'll be begging me to take her back before the year's out." The threat hung in the morning air as the sound of hoofbeats faded toward town. Diego remained on the porch, his keen eyes following the riders until they disappeared over a rise in the grassland. "That one will cause more trouble," the foreman observed quietly. "Men like that don't forget when they're made to look small in front of others." Nathaniel nodded, still staring toward town, though the riders were long gone. "I know, but some things are worth the risk." A soft footstep behind him announced Beatrice's presence. She'd come downstairs while he was watching Henry leave, and now stood in the doorway with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, a recognition that she'd witnessed something rare in her experience. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotions she was struggling to contain. $500, that's more money than most people see in a lifetime. It was worth every cent to see the look on his face when... "He realized you were beyond his reach," Nathaniel replied, turning to meet her eyes. "Besides, I've learned that money spent on the right cause tends to come back tenfold." She stepped onto the porch, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were testing the reality of her freedom. "He's right about one thing, though. People will talk. Your reputation—" "My reputation will survive," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "The question is whether you're prepared for what comes next. Henry's gone, but the town's judgment remains. They'll see you as a curse, and me as a fool for defying their superstitions." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, her gaze following the path the riders had taken. When she spoke, her voice carried a strength that had been building since he'd pulled her from the sand. "I've been buried once already," she said simply. "I'm not afraid of their judgment anymore." In that moment, watching her face the prospect of continued persecution with quiet courage, Nathaniel realized that his $500 had purchased more than Henry Fulton's absence. It had bought them both a chance at something neither had dared to hope for, the possibility of a life defined not by past failures, but by present choices. The morning sun climbed higher over the valley, burning away the last shadows from corners where doubt might hide. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song of territorial claim, marking boundaries that mattered far more than any legal document or social convention. They had chosen each other in the most fundamental way possible. Everything else would have to accommodate that simple truth. In the days following Henry's departure, Beatrice threw herself into ranch life with the fervor of someone determined to earn her place through usefulness. She rose before dawn to help Mrs. Patterson prepare breakfast for the hands, her movements quick and efficient as she learned the rhythm of feeding a dozen hard-working men. The kitchen became her domain, filled with the scents of baking bread and simmering stews that transformed a house into a home. Nathaniel watched her transformation with quiet admiration. The frightened, broken woman he'd pulled from the sand was emerging into someone stronger, not harder, but tempered by experience into resilience. She moved through his house with growing confidence, though he noticed she still avoided the closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Margaret's room remained exactly as it had been on the day she died 3 years ago. The four-poster bed, with its rose-colored quilt, the vanity table with silver brushes still holding strands of golden hair, the rocking chair positioned near the window where she'd spent her final weeks watching the valley she'd grown to love. Mrs. Patterson dusted it weekly, maintaining the space like a shrine to interrupted dreams on a particularly warm afternoon, while Nathaniel worked with Diego to repair fence line damaged by the recent storms. Beatrice made her way upstairs to air out the unused bedrooms. She'd been avoiding Margaret's door for a week, but something about the stifling heat made her pause outside the closed portal. The brass doorknob turned easily under her hand, revealing a room preserved in amber-colored sunlight. Dust motes danced in the air as she stepped across the threshold, her breath catching at the intimacy of the space. This was where Nathaniel had loved and lost, where dreams of family had bloomed and withered. On the vanity, beside the silver brushes, sat a small wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Curiosity overcame discretion, and Beatrice lifted the lid to reveal a collection of tiny garments, baby clothes lovingly stitched by hand but never worn. A christening gown of pure white linen, tiny booties no bigger than her thumb, a little gap edged with delicate lace. Each piece represented hope that had died with its intended wearer. She was holding the christening gown when footsteps on the stairs announced Nathaniel's return. He appeared in the doorway, his shirt dusty from the day's work, and stopped abruptly when he saw her standing in Margaret's room. "I'm sorry," Beatrice said quickly, moving to replace the gown in its box. "I didn't mean to intrude, I was just—" "It's all right." His voice was quiet, neither angry nor pained, but thoughtful. "I suppose it's time someone disturbed the dust. In here." He entered the room slowly, as if crossing into territory he'd avoided for too long. His eyes moved over familiar objects. The music box Margaret had brought from her childhood home, the photograph of them on their wedding day, the novel she'd been reading when the fever took her, still bookmarked at page 43. "She made those herself," he said, nodding toward the baby clothes. "Started the day after we were married, convinced that if she prepared properly, children would surely follow." He picked up one of the tiny booties, turning it over in his work-roughened hands. "She kept adding to the collection every month, even when it became clear that hope was all we had." Beatrice set down the christening gown with reverent care. "She must have been very special." She was. Nathaniel's smile carried sadness, but no bitterness. Kind, patient, full of dreams about the family we'd raise here. She would have loved children, any children. Didn't matter if they came from her body or someone else's heart. The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. Here was a woman who'd loved beyond the boundaries of blood, who defined family through affection rather than biology. "What happened to her?" Beatrice asked gently. "Influenza 3 winters ago. Swept through the valley like wildfire, took young and old alike." Nathaniel set the booty back in its place among the other small garments. "She was carrying our son when she got sick. Lost them both in the same week." Beatrice's hand went instinctively to her own flat belly, remembering the years of hoping and disappointment, the monthly cycle of expectation and grief. "I'm sorry. So am I." He looked around the room with eyes that seemed to be seeing it clearly for the first time in years. "I've kept this room like a museum, thinking it honored her memory. But Margaret wasn't the type to want shrines. She was practical, forward-looking. She'd have packed these things away by now and turned the room into something useful. Together, they began the work of carefully folding away the past. Beatrice handled each item with the reverence of someone who understood their significance, while Nathaniel shared memories attached to various objects. The music box had been a wedding gift from Margaret's aunt. The novel was one she'd read aloud to him in the evenings, her voice bringing characters to life by lamplight. The photograph had been taken by a traveling portraitist who'd passed through the valley just after their first anniversary. As they worked, the conversation flowed naturally between them. Nathaniel spoke of Margaret's laughter, her habit of humming, while she cooked, her determination to create a garden in soil that seemed determined to remain wild. Beatrice shared tentative memories of her own former life, the herb garden she'd maintained behind the cabin she'd shared with Henry, the healing teas she'd brewed for neighbors who now shunned her, the quiet satisfaction she'd found in useful work before being deemed useless. "You have knowledge of healing plants?" Nathaniel asked, pausing in his folding of a quilt to look at her with interest. "My grandmother taught me before she passed. Said women needed to know how to tend their families when doctors were too far away or too expensive." Beatrice's eyes brightened with the memory of skills that had been dismissed as worthless by Henry, but might find purpose here. "I know which plants stop bleeding, which ones ease pain, which ones can bring down a fever." Mrs. Patterson would welcome the help. "We're isolated here, and the nearest doctor is 2 days hard riding. Your knowledge could save lives." The possibility of being useful, truly useful, not just tolerated, sent warmth through her chest. For the first time since leaving her childhood home, she felt the stirring of something that might eventually become belonging. They packed away the last of Margaret's personal belongings as afternoon shadows grew long across the valley. The room felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if it were waiting to be filled with new purpose rather than maintained as a monument to loss. "Thank you," Nathaniel said, as they stood in the doorway, looking back at the cleared space. "I couldn't have done this alone." "Yes, you could have," Beatrice replied quietly. "You just needed a reason to begin." That evening, as the ranch hands finished their supper and began gathering around the bunkhouse for their usual card games, Beatrice made a decision that surprised even herself. She approached the group with a worn Bible in her hands and a proposition that would change the evening routine. "I noticed some of you might benefit from learning letters," she said simply, addressing men who'd grown used to being invisible to respectable society. "I thought I might offer instruction if anyone's interested." Tommy Reeves, barely 18 and eager to improve himself, was the first to nod. Soon others followed. Cowboys who'd never had the chance for schooling, older men who'd forgotten skills they'd once possessed, immigrants whose English was stronger spoken than written. As the impromptu school session began under the light of oil lamps, Nathaniel watched from the porch with something that might have been wonder. The woman who'd been buried as cursed was teaching literacy to men society had written off as worthless. In the warm circle of lamplight, barriers of class and circumstance seemed to dissolve into simple human connection. Diego joined him on the porch, both men observing the scene with satisfaction. "She has the heart of a teacher," the foreman observed quietly. "She has the heart of someone who understands what it means to be overlooked," Nathaniel replied. "That's even more valuable." Inside the circle of light, Beatrice guided Tommy's finger along the words of a psalm, her voice patient and encouraging. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. 2 weeks into the evening reading lessons, opportunity arrived in the form of Jake Morrison's accident. The young cowhand had been breaking a particularly stubborn Mustang when the horse threw him hard against the corral fence, leaving him unconscious, with blood streaming from a gash on his forehead and his left arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Diego and Tommy carried him to the ranch house, while Nathaniel rode hard for the doctor in Millfield, knowing the 2-day round trip would be too late if Jake's injuries were as serious as they appeared. It was Beatrice who took charge, her movements swift and sure as she examined the unconscious man. "His arm's broken, but it's a clean break," she announced, running experienced hands along the injured limb. "The head wound looks worse than it is. Scalp cuts always bleed heavily. Mrs. Patterson, I'll need clean cloths, hot water and that. Bottle of whiskey from the kitchen." While the housekeeper gathered supplies, Beatrice disappeared into her room and returned with a leather pouch she'd kept hidden since her arrival. Inside were dried herbs and roots, carefully preserved from her grandmother's teachings: willow bark for pain, comfrey for healing, golden seal for infection. "Tommy, ride out toward the creek and bring me back some fresh willow branches, the young ones with green bark," she instructed while cleaning Jake's wounds. "Diego, help me set this arm properly." The foreman watched with growing respect as Beatrice worked with quiet competence. She set the bone with firm precision, Jake's unconscious state sparing him the worst of the pain. The head wound she cleaned and bound with practiced efficiency, her movements those of someone who'd tended serious injuries before. "Where did you learn to do this?" Diego asked as they positioned splints along Jake's arm. "Necessity," Beatrice replied simply. "On isolated farms, women learn to be everything: nurse, midwife, veterinarian. My grandmother said healing was women's work because we understood that life was precious enough to fight for." She brewed a tea from the willow bark Tommy had brought, managing to get some of the liquid down Jake's throat despite his unconscious state. Then she prepared a poultice from comfrey leaves and golden seal root, applying it to the head wound with gentle thoroughness. "He'll sleep for hours, maybe through the night," she explained to the concerned ranch hands who'd gathered in the kitchen. "The willow bark will help with the pain when he wakes, and the poultice should prevent infection, but someone needs to watch him. Wake me if his breathing changes or if he starts running a fever." Mrs. Patterson volunteered for the first watch, settling into a chair beside the improvised sickbed with her knitting and a pot of coffee. The ranch hands dispersed to their evening chores with visible relief, having witnessed something that bordered on the miraculous in their frontier world. Nathaniel returned the next afternoon to find Jake sitting up in bed, his head bandaged, but his eyes clear and focused. The young cowhand was sipping broth and complaining about being coddled, sure signs of recovery that made Nathaniel's heart lighten with relief and gratitude. "Doc Patterson here says I'd have died without Mrs. Fulton's doctoring," Jake announced, nodding toward Beatrice with the reverence of someone who owed their life to another's skill. "Says she set my arm better than most real doctors could manage." Nathaniel found Beatrice in the kitchen, grinding more willow bark with a mortar and pestle, while Mrs. Patterson prepared the evening meal. She looked up at his approach, her cheeks flushed with the satisfaction of useful work. "How is he really?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "He'll be fine. The arm will heal straight and strong, and there's no sign of serious head injury." He was lucky. Another few inches and that fence post might have cracked his skull. She set down the pestle and met his eyes directly. "Your ranch hands have been asking me to teach them about healing plants. They want to know which ones grow, local, how to prepare them for emergencies. And you're willing to share that knowledge?" "It seems selfish to keep it to myself when it could help people," she replied. "Knowledge is only valuable when it's used." That evening, as Jake slept peacefully and the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythm, Mrs. Patterson drew Nathaniel aside for a conversation that had been building for days. "There's something you should know about Margaret," the housekeeper said quietly, her weathered hands folded in her apron. "Something I never told you because it wasn't my place, and because you were grieving too deeply to hear it." Nathaniel felt a chill of apprehension. "What about Margaret?" the doctor told. "That last winter before she got sick. The reason you two never had children, it wasn't her failing." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the weight of a secret too long held. "Some women just aren't made for bearing," he said. "But some men aren't made for giving life either. Margaret made me promise never to tell you, said it would break your heart to know." The revelation hit him like a physical blow, reframing years of assumptions and self-recrimination. He'd spent 3 years believing that Margaret had died thinking herself a failure when all along she'd been protecting him from the same crushing sense of inadequacy. "She knew I blamed myself," he said finally, the pieces of memory rearranging themselves into a different pattern. "All those times she comforted me, said it was God's will, that we were meant to love in different ways. She was trying to spare me the truth." "She loved you too much to let you carry that burden," Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "Said some truths were too heavy for the people we love to bear, especially when they wouldn't change anything important." Nathaniel walked out onto the porch, needing the cool night air and the vast sky to process this fundamental shift in his understanding of the past. Margaret had carried the knowledge of their shared childlessness as her private burden, protecting his pride even in her final illness. The front door opened behind him, and Beatrice emerged with 2 cups of coffee, settling into the rocking chair beside his own with comfortable familiarity. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Mrs. Patterson told you," Beatrice said finally, her voice carrying understanding rather than pity, "about Margaret knowing we'd never have children." He accepted, the coffee gratefully, letting its warmth steady him. 3 years I've been thinking she died, believing herself a failure, and now you know she died protecting you from feeling like one yourself." Beatrice's words carried the wisdom of someone who understood the complex mathematics of love and sacrifice. "That's not a burden, Nathaniel. That's a gift. She loved you enough to bear that knowledge alone, so you wouldn't have to." They rocked gently in the evening breeze, 2 people who'd been labeled failures by a society that measured worth in narrow terms. The ranch around them hummed with quiet activity, horses settling for the night, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the soft murmur of ranch hands sharing stories around their bunkhouse fire. "I never thanked you properly for what you did for Jake today," Nathaniel said eventually. Your knowledge saved his life, maybe his livelihood. I'm glad I could help. It felt good to be useful again, to use skills that matter. She set her empty cup on the porch railing and turned to face him. I know what it's like to be labeled barren, to be seen as broken because your body won't do what society expects. But we're not broken, Nathaniel. We're just different. And different doesn't mean worthless. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, he could see the strength that had emerged from her ordeal in the desert, the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived the worst and discovered they were stronger than they'd known. She was beautiful, not in the ethereal way Margaret had been, but with the earned beauty of resilience and compassion tested by fire. The realization that he was falling in love with her came not as a thunderbolt but as a gradual dawn, inevitable and warming. It terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. This possibility of a second chance at happiness with someone who understood both loss and hope. But for now, it was enough to sit beside her in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, while Jake healed in the house behind them, and the ranch hands learned their letters by lamplight. Sometimes the most profound changes began not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet moments of recognition, two hearts acknowledging their compatibility across the distance of separate sorrows. The railroad surveyors arrived on a Tuesday morning in late summer, their instruments glinting in the sun as they set up their equipment on the ridge overlooking the valley. Nathaniel watched them from his porch, a mixture of anticipation and unease settling in his chest like an approaching storm. The westward expansion of the rail lines represented opportunity beyond his wildest dreams and the potential end of the life he'd built here. Samuel Bridgman, the lead surveyor, was a thin man with wire spectacles and the pale complexion of someone who spent more time with maps than under open sky. He approached the ranch house with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to dealing with landowners whose property stood between progress and profit. Mr. Cross, Bridgman began without preamble, unrolling a detailed survey map across the porch table. I represent the Central Plains Railroad Company. We are prepared to make you a very generous offer for right-of-way access through your property. Nathaniel studied the map, noting how the proposed rail line would cut directly through the heart of his ranch, bisecting the grazing lands and requiring the relocation of buildings that had taken years to establish. The red line drawn across his property looked like a wound. How generous, he asked, though money wasn't his primary concern. $50,000, plus guaranteed freight rates for shipping your cattle to eastern markets. Bridgman's voice carried the confidence of a man who rarely heard the word no. The rail line will triple the value of your remaining land and cut your transportation costs by 70%. The figure was staggering, more money than most frontier settlers would see in a lifetime. But as Nathaniel looked out over the valley Margaret had loved, where he'd buried his family and found Beatrice, he felt something more valuable than wealth slipping away. I'll need time to consider your offer, he said finally. Of course, but I should mention that we have government backing for this route. If necessary, eminent domain provisions allow us to acquire the land through legal channels. Bridgman's tone remained polite, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. We'd prefer a willing seller, naturally. After the surveyor left, Nathaniel found himself staring at the map they'd left behind, tracing the red line that would transform everything he'd worked to build. Progress was inevitable, he knew, but that didn't make the prospect of change any less unsettling. Beatrice found him there an hour later, her arms full of wildflowers she'd been gathering for the kitchen table. She set down her burden and studied, his troubled expression with growing concern. The railroad wants to buy the ranch, she asked, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. Part of it, the part that matters most. He rolled up the map with movements that spoke of suppressed frustration. They're offering enough money to buy half the territory, but they'd cut the heart out of this place doing it. She sat beside him on the porch steps, her presence immediately calming despite the magnitude of the decision facing them. What does your heart tell you? That money can't replace what we'd lose. This valley, this view, the graves on that hill. He gestured toward the cottonwood trees where Margaret and their son rested. Some things shouldn't have a price, but the practical benefits, easier shipping, increased land values, connection to the wider world, those matter too, Beatrice said thoughtfully. Progress doesn't ask permission before it changes everything around us. They sat in comfortable silence, both wrestling with implications that extended far beyond property values. The railroad would bring new people, new opportunities, new challenges. To their carefully constructed peace. "Ride with me," Nathaniel said suddenly, rising and extending his hand to her. "I want to show you something." They saddled horses and rode toward the high meadow where cattle grazed among scattered wildflowers. The afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, transforming the ordinary landscape into something almost magical. From the ridge, they could see for miles in every direction, rolling grassland stretching toward distant mountains. The silver thread of the creek winding through cottonwood groves, the ranch buildings looking small but permanent against the vast sky. "Margaret used to come here when she needed to think," Nathaniel said, dismounting near a natural shelter formed by wind-carved rocks. "She said being up here reminded her that most problems were smaller than they seemed." Beatrice slid down from her saddle and walked to the edge of the overlook, her hair stirring in the constant breeze that swept across the high country. She was right. From here, even the railroad seems like just another scratch across the landscape. They stood together at the precipice, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she'd taken to using, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her sun-touched skin. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities. Neither had spoken aloud. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Nathaniel said quietly, his words barely audible above the whisper of wind through the grass. "Feel what way?" But Beatrice's voice carried knowledge of what he was about to say, hope and fear mingling in the simple question, like I had something worth fighting for, someone worth. He turned to face her, searching her expression for any sign that his feelings were reciprocated. "Beatrice, these past weeks, watching you bring life back to the ranch, seeing you teach the hands, healing Jake, you've made me remember what it feels like to hope for the future." She reached up and touched his face gently, her fingertips tracing the lines that grief and responsibility had carved around his eyes. "I never thought anyone would see me as more than a burden again, but you look at me like I'm valuable. Like I have something to offer besides apologies for what I can't be." The distance between them disappeared, as if pulled by some force stronger than gravity. When their lips met, it was with the desperate tenderness of two people who'd learned not to take love for granted. The kiss was soft at first, then deeper as years of loneliness and self-doubt melted away in the warmth of mutual recognition. When they finally separated, both were breathing unsteadily, the careful walls they'd maintained around their hearts lying in ruins between them. "This complicates everything," Beatrice whispered, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Nathaniel replied, pressing his forehead against hers in a gesture of intimate connection. "Simple things rarely matter enough to fight for." They rode back to the ranch as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, both changed by what had passed between them on the ridge. The railroad survey map waiting on Nathaniel's desk suddenly seemed less important than the woman beside him, and the decision about selling land less critical than the question of building a life together. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, with Mrs. Patterson and the recovered Jake, the easy domesticity of the scene felt different, charged with new possibilities. The ranch hands noticed the subtle change in their interactions, the way Nathaniel's eyes lingered on Beatrice's face, the way she smiled more readily and seemed to take up more space in conversations. After the meal, Tommy approached hesitantly. with a question about a particularly challenging passage in his reading primer. As Beatrice patiently worked through the difficult words with him, Nathaniel found himself imagining other children around this table, orphans and strays who might find sanctuary here, a family built not through blood but through choice and love. The railroad could take the land, but it couldn't touch what truly mattered. Love, it turned out, was the one thing that didn't require right-of-way access or government approval. It simply was, growing quietly in the space between two hearts that had learned to trust again. Outside, the evening star appeared above the mountains, bright and constant in the darkening sky. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not, but together they might weather whatever storms progress brought to their valley. Some things, after all, were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The news of their growing attachment spread through the territory like wildfire, carried by supply wagons and visiting merchants who'd witnessed the careful tenderness between Nathaniel and Beatrice. By autumn, when the cottonwood leaves turned, gold and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. Their love had become the subject of intense scrutiny and disapproval throughout the region. Beatrice had begun sleeping poorly, her dreams troubled by scenarios where her presence brought ruin to everything Nathaniel had built. She'd taken to rising before dawn, slipping from the house to walk among Mrs. Patterson's frost-touched garden, seeking solitude where she could wrestle with her growing certainty that love alone wouldn't be enough to shield them from society's judgment. It was during one of these solitary morning walks that she discovered Margaret's sewing room in the attic, a space Mrs. Patterson had mentioned but never shown her. Climbing the narrow stairs with a lamp in hand, she found herself in a cozy alcove under the eaves, where afternoon light slanted through a small dormer window onto a table scattered with fabric patterns and half-finished projects. Among Margaret's unfinished work, Beatrice found a wedding dress pattern, delicate and elegant, with detailed notes in the margins about modifications and improvements. The dress had been intended for a neighbor's daughter, but influenza had claimed its maker. Before completion, the pattern lay abandoned, its careful measurements and artistic vision waiting for skilled hands to bring it to life. Without quite understanding why, Beatrice began working on the dress during her sleepless hours. Her stitches were smaller and more precise than Margaret's had been, her alterations subtle but improving the original design. The work soothed her restless mind and gave purpose to the anxious energy that kept her awake. She was absorbed in the delicate beadwork on the bodice when Nathaniel's voice from the bottom of the attic stairs startled her from her concentration. "Beatrice? Mrs. Patterson said you might be up here." "I'm sorry," she called down, hastily covering the dress with a cloth. "I know I should have asked permission before—" "You don't need permission to use any part of this house," he interrupted, his boots heavy on the wooden steps as he climbed toward her. "This is your home now, even if we haven't made it official yet." He appeared in the lamplight, his hair tousled from sleep and concern creasing his features. "You've been getting up earlier and earlier. Mrs. Patterson's worried, and so am I." Beatrice set down her needle and met his eyes directly, knowing the conversation they'd been avoiding could no longer be postponed. "I've been thinking about leaving, Nathaniel. Not because I want to, but because staying might destroy everything you've worked for." The words hung between them like a physical barrier, more substantial than the fabric scattered across the sewing table. "Leaving?" His voice carried disbelief and hurt in equal measure. "Running away won't solve anything, Beatrice. We've been through this." "Have we? Because every week brings new pressure from the town, new threats to your business relationships, new reasons for people to question your judgment." She stood and began pacing the small space, her movements sharp with suppressed anxiety. "Yesterday, Diego told me the grain merchant in Millfield is refusing to sell to us because he believes I'm cursed. How long before the bank starts questioning your loans? How long before the railroad decides they don't want to do business with someone the whole territory considers touched by madness?" Nathaniel crossed to her, catching her hands in his own and stilling her restless movement. "Let them question. Let them judge. I have more money than most of them will see in a lifetime, and more reasons to fight than they'll ever understand. But at what cost? Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over, though her voice remained steady. You've already sacrificed your standing in the community for me. How much more will you give up before you resent me for it? The question struck him like a physical blow, not because he felt any resentment, but because he realized how deeply her past had convinced her that love was temporary and conditional. Henry Fulton had taught her that marriage was a transaction where she was always the debtor, never the valued partner. Sit with me, he said gently, guiding her to a small bench beside the dormer window. I want to tell you about the day Margaret died. Beatrice settled beside him, her hands still clasped in his own, while outside the window the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. She was unconscious by then, the fever having taken almost everything from her, but there were moments when she'd surface briefly. During one of those times, she looked at me with perfect clarity and said something I've never forgotten. His voice grew thick with the memory. She said, "Promise me you won't let fear make you smaller than you are. Promise me you'll choose love when it comes again, even if the world tells you not to." He turned to face Beatrice fully, his eyes reflecting the growing dawn light. I made that promise to a dying woman who understood that love is rare enough to fight for, regardless of what other people think. And now you're asking me to break that promise by letting fear drive you away. I'm not running from fear, Beatrice protested, though her voice lacked conviction. I'm trying to protect what we have from what? From people who buried you in the sand for being different, from a society that measures worth by the ability to produce children. His hands tightened around hers. Beatrice, if we let their judgment dictate our choices, they win, and more importantly, we lose everything that matters. She was quiet for several minutes, studying their joined hands while wrestling with the remnants of self-doubt that Henry's cruelty had planted deep in her heart. Outside, the ranch was beginning to stir. Mrs. Patterson lighting the kitchen stove, Diego calling instructions to the hands, the everyday sounds of a life she'd helped create. I found something up here, she said finally, reaching for the covered dress. She pulled away the cloth to reveal the intricate beadwork and careful stitching. Margaret's wedding dress pattern. I've been working on it, finishing what she started. Nathaniel stared at the beautiful garment, recognition dawning on his features. She was making this for the Henderson girls' wedding before she got sick. I thought perhaps we could give it to someone who needed it, someone who couldn't afford such finery but deserved to feel beautiful on their wedding day. Beatrice's voice carried tentative hope. It seemed like something Margaret would have wanted, to see her work bring joy to someone else. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. Here was Margaret's unfinished dream, completed by hands that loved the man she'd left behind, intended as a gift for someone else's happiness. It represented continuity rather than replacement, honor rather than forgetting. There's something else I want to show you, Beatrice continued, reaching into her sewing basket to retrieve a folded document. I've been working on this too. She handed him a letter written in her careful script, addressed to the railroad company. As he read, his eyebrows rose with surprise and admiration. You've been researching alternative routes, he said, scanning the detailed proposal she'd crafted, ones that would avoid the cemetery hill and the main house, while still giving them access to the valley. I spent hours studying those survey maps. There are ways to accomplish what they need without destroying what matters most to you. It might cost them slightly more, but the engineering challenges aren't insurmountable. She watched his face anxiously. I know it's presumptuous of me to interfere in your business decisions, but it's brilliant, he interrupted, pulling her into his arms with sudden fierce joy. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's exactly the kind of thinking Margaret would have applauded. As dawn broke fully over the valley, filling the small attic room with golden light, they sat together, planning a future that honored the past, while embracing change. The wedding dress lay between them like a bridge between Margaret's dreams and their own. while outside the window the ranch awakened to another day of possibilities. "Marry me," Nathaniel said suddenly, the words emerging with the clarity of absolute certainty. "Not because it's practical or expected, but because I love you, and life is too short to waste time on other people's opinions." Beatrice's answer came in the form of a kiss that tasted of tears and hope in equal measure, sealing a promise that would weather whatever storms lay ahead. They had found each other in the desert of their separate sorrows, and now they would build something beautiful together, regardless of who thought they didn't deserve happiness. The sun climbed higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and green, while in the attic of the ranch house, two hearts made their quiet revolution against a world that had tried to bury them both. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with only the ranch family present to witness their vows. Mrs. Patterson had decorated the front porch with autumn flowers and golden leaves, creating a bower of natural beauty that rivaled any church altar. Diego stood as Nathaniel's witness, while Mrs. Patterson served the same role for Beatrice, both beaming with the satisfaction of people who'd watched love triumph over circumstances. Beatrice wore the completed wedding dress, Margaret's, pattern brought to life with her own careful stitches. The gown fit her perfectly, its ivory silk and delicate beadwork catching the morning light as she spoke her vows with quiet conviction. There was no preacher. They'd exchanged written promises before God and witnesses, legal and binding under territorial law. The ceremony was simple but profound, two people choosing each other, despite a world that questioned their right to happiness. When Nathaniel kissed his bride, the ranch hands cheered with genuine joy, these hard-working men having long since adopted Beatrice as family worth celebrating. The wedding feast stretched into the afternoon, with Mrs. Patterson outdoing herself in the kitchen, and the hands contributing stories and songs that painted the valley with laughter. As evening approached, the newlyweds retreated to the house, while their chosen family continued celebrating around a bonfire that sent sparks dancing toward the star-filled sky. Their wedding night was tender and hesitant, two wounded souls learning to trust completely. Nathaniel was gentle with Beatrice, patient with her fears, and responsive to her courage. In the quiet intimacy of their marriage bed, they discovered that physical love could heal as well as create, binding them together in ways that transcended the legal documents that made their union official. 3 days later, as they were settling into the rhythm of married life, a lone rider approached the ranch with the measured pace of someone bearing official business. Dr. William Hamilton had been traveling through the territory, offering his services to remote communities too isolated for regular medical care. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect and authority. Nathaniel greeted him on the porch, extending the hospitality that was both custom and necessity in frontier country. "Dr. Hamilton, welcome to the Cross Ranch. What brings you our way? I heard you had a skilled healer here, someone who'd saved a cowhand's life with nothing but plant medicine and good sense," Hamilton replied, accepting the offered chair and the glass of cool water Mrs. Patterson provided. "Professional curiosity, you might say. I like to meet people who share my calling, even if they lack formal training." Beatrice emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and stopped short when she saw their visitor. Something in the doctor's face triggered a flash of recognition that she couldn't quite place. "You must be Mrs. Cross," Hamilton said, rising courteously. "I've heard remarkable things about your healing skills." "I only know what my grandmother taught me," Beatrice replied modestly, though she continued studying his features with growing unease. The doctor's expression shifted as he looked at her more closely, his professional eye taking in details that others might miss. "Forgive me, but have we met? There's something familiar about you." "I don't believe so, sir." But even as she spoke, memory began stirring. A tall man with silver hair bending over a sickbed, his voice gentle as he delivered news that shattered. "Dreams, Cross Ranch," Hamilton mused. Then his eyes widened with sudden recognition. Good Lord, you're not Nathaniel Cross, the cattle rancher. You're Nathaniel Cross, who was married to Margaret Whitfield. Nathaniel nodded, puzzled by the doctor's intense reaction. You knew Margaret? I treated her during her final illness 3 years ago. She was... Hamilton paused, his eyes moving between Nathaniel and Beatrice with growing concern. Mr. Cross, I need to speak with you privately. There are matters we discussed then that you should know. A chill of apprehension settled over the porch as the 3 adults regarded each other with the tension of people standing at the edge of revelations that might change everything. Mrs. Patterson, sensing the gravity of the moment, quietly retreated to the kitchen while motioning for any curious ranch hands to give their employers privacy. Anything you have to say can be said in front of my wife, Nathaniel declared, reaching for Beatrice's hand in a gesture of unity and protection. Dr. Hamilton looked deeply uncomfortable, his professional discretion warring with humanitarian concern. Mr. Cross, during Margaret's final days, when the fever was at its worst, she confided certain things to me. Medical matters that she'd been carrying as a private burden. What kind of medical matters? Nathaniel's voice carried the edge of a man preparing for bad news. The doctor reached into his medical bag and withdrew a leather portfolio, extracting a document that bore official seals and careful handwriting. She made me promise to keep this confidential. That's correct, Dr. Hamilton confirmed gently. The fault, if we must use such a harsh word, wasn't hers. In cases where healthy couples fail to conceive over extended periods, the issue typically lies with the male partner. The revelation hit Nathaniel like a physical blow, reframing not only his marriage to Margaret, but his understanding of his own identity as a man. For years, he'd accepted society's assumption that barrenness was a female failing, allowing Margaret to bear the shame while he remained blameless in the eyes of their community. Beatrice felt her knees weaken as the implications became clear. She sank into her chair, her mind racing through the ramifications of this knowledge. You mean both our marriages failed for the same reason, but we were blamed while our husbands escaped judgment? It's unfortunately common, Dr. Hamilton admitted. Society finds it easier to blame women for these matters, and medical knowledge on the subject is still primitive. But yes, based on my examination of your late wife and what I've observed of similar cases, I would say the inability to conceive was not Mrs. Margaret's failing. Nathaniel stared at the document in his hands, seeing his entire past through a different lens. Margaret had known the truth, but had chosen to protect him from it, carrying the shame of their childlessness as her private burden, even as she lay, dying. The magnitude of her sacrifice hit him with devastating force. She knew, he whispered, remembering her gentle comfort during the dark months when hope had gradually died. All those times, I talked about God's will and acceptance. She knew it wasn't her fault, but let me think otherwise. She asked me not to tell you, because she said it wouldn't change anything except to transfer the burden of blame from her shoulders to yours, Dr. Hamilton explained with professional compassion. She believed love was more important than biological accuracy. Beatrice reached for Nathaniel's hand, finding it trembling with the shock of realization. Her own mind was reeling with the knowledge that 2 marriages had been destroyed by medical ignorance and social prejudice that consistently blamed women for circumstances beyond anyone's control. This changes everything, Nathaniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't quite name. Every assumption, every judgment, every moment of self-recrimination. No, Beatrice interrupted firmly, her voice gaining strength as she processed the full meaning of the doctor's revelation. This changes nothing that matters. We married each other knowing we might never have children. We chose love over society's expectations. Learning the medical truth behind our circumstances doesn't alter the choice we made. Dr. Hamilton nodded approvingly. Your wife speaks wisdom, Mr. Cross. The truth can be liberating, but it's what we do with truth that defines our character. As the doctor prepared to continue his journey, declining their invitation to stay for supper, Nathaniel and Beatrice were left to process revelations that recontextualized their entire understanding of their past struggles. They sat in their porch chairs as afternoon shadows lengthened, each lost in thoughts about blame and forgiveness, truth and love. "I spent 3 years thinking Margaret died, believing she'd failed me," Nathaniel said finally. "Now I discover she spent those same 3 years protecting me from knowing I'd failed her." "Neither of you failed anyone," Beatrice replied with quiet conviction. "You loved each other as deeply as two people can. Children would have been a blessing, but their absence doesn't diminish what you shared." The sun was setting behind the mountains when they finally rose from their chairs and walked inside to face their future with new understanding. The ranch hands were returning from their day's work, unaware that their employers had just discovered truths that would reshape their understanding of love, blame, and the complex mathematics of human judgment. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson was preparing their delayed supper, humming softly as she worked. The domestic scene felt both familiar and transformed. Like everything else in their lives since Dr. Hamilton's visit, they had married as two people society had labeled as failures, finding redemption in mutual acceptance. Now they knew the truth behind their supposed inadequacies, but that knowledge only reinforced what they'd already learned. Love wasn't diminished by the absence of children, and worth wasn't measured by society's narrow definitions of success. The medical certificate lay on Nathaniel's desk, official proof of facts that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Outside their window, the evening star appeared above the mountains, constant and bright in a world where truth often came disguised as devastating revelation. They had survived the desert of their separate sorrows and found each other despite the cruelty of ignorant judgment. This new knowledge would test them again, but they would face it as they faced everything else. Together, with love as their compass and truth as their foundation for building whatever came next. Winter settled over the valley like a blanket of enforced solitude, isolating the ranch from the outside world in ways that should have felt peaceful, but instead carried an undercurrent of building tension. Snow piled against the fences and drifted across the road to town, creating a natural barrier that matched the social isolation they'd been experiencing since their marriage. The campaign against them had grown more sophisticated and vindictive as autumn turned to winter. What had begun as whispered gossip and social shunning had evolved into coordinated economic pressure designed to force them out of the territory entirely. Merchants in 3 towns now refused to sell them supplies. The bank in Millfield had quietly suggested that Nathaniel might want to consider relocating his accounts to a more suitable location. Even the railroad company had begun expressing concerns about doing business with someone whose reputation might damage their corporate image. Nathaniel spent his mornings reviewing financial documents and correspondence that painted an increasingly dire picture of their situation. His wealth provided a buffer against immediate hardship, but money couldn't buy acceptance from suppliers who decided his marriage represented a threat to community values. "They're trying to starve us out," Diego observed during a private conversation in the barn, his weathered face grim with understanding of tactics he'd seen employed against other outsiders. "Make it impossible for us to operate the ranch. Force us to sell and move somewhere they don't have to look at what offends them." "Can they succeed?" Nathaniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Depends how long you're willing to fight and how much you're willing to sacrifice," the foreman replied honestly. "We can survive the winter on stored supplies and cattle sales to buyers outside the territory, but come spring, if nothing changes, we'll face some hard choices." The isolation affected each member of their ranch family differently. Mrs. Patterson threw herself into preserving foods and maintaining household routines with military precision, as if perfect domestic order could hold chaos at bay. The ranch hands grew quieter and more protective, their loyalty to Nathaniel and Beatrice expressing itself in subtle ways. Extra vigilance during night watches, careful attention to any strangers approaching the property, unspoken readiness for trouble that might come calling. Beatrice responded to the pressure by doubling down on the activities that gave her purpose and joy. Her evening literacy classes continued despite the cold, with ranch hands gathering around the kitchen fire to practice reading and writing by lamplight. She expanded her healing knowledge by experimenting with different preparations of local plants, creating a comprehensive medicinal garden plan for the coming spring. Most importantly, she began working on a project that would either cement their place in the community or provide them with the means to leave it behind entirely. Hidden in Margaret's sewing room, she spent her mornings drafting detailed letters to territorial newspapers, documenting the medical realities behind barren marriages and challenging the superstitions that allowed communities to scapegoat childless women. Her writing was careful and researched, drawing on Dr. Hamilton's visit and her own painful experience to craft arguments that might change minds, or at least plant seeds of doubt about accepted wisdom. "I want to publish these," she told Nathaniel one evening, spreading the carefully written pages across his desk like a battle plan. "Send them to newspapers in Denver, St. Louis, maybe even Chicago. Let people read about what really happens when communities decide certain citizens don't deserve basic human dignity." Nathaniel studied her work with growing admiration and concern. The writing was powerful, well-reasoned, and absolutely guaranteed to make their situation worse in the short term. "Beatrice, this is brilliant work, but publishing it will be like declaring war on every community that's ever buried a barren woman. They won't just shun us, they'll actively try to destroy us." "Then we'll face that together too," she replied, with the quiet determination of someone who'd already been buried once and survived. "I refuse to let other women endure what we've endured in silence. If speaking the truth costs us everything, at least it will cost us everything while standing for something that matters." Her conviction was infectious and terrifying in equal measure. Nathaniel found himself torn between protective instincts that urged caution and admiration for her. Courage in the face of certain retaliation. The woman who'd been pulled half dead from the sand was preparing to fight battles that extended far beyond their own circumstances. As winter deepened, they began receiving more direct threats. Anonymous letters appeared in their mailbox, warning of divine judgment and community action against those who defied God's will. Cattle were found with their water sources mysteriously fouled, requiring constant vigilance to prevent poisoning of the entire herd. Fences were cut in the night, allowing livestock to wander into dangerous terrain where they might be injured or lost. The harassment escalated when they discovered that someone had been systematically spreading rumors about Beatrice practicing witchcraft, using her herbal knowledge as evidence of supernatural interference with natural order. The accusations were absurd, but dangerous in a community already primed to believe the worst about her. "They're building towards something," Diego warned after finding evidence that someone had been surveying the ranch at night, leaving tracks near the main house and barn. "This isn't random harassment anymore. Somebody's planning something specific." Nathaniel made the decision to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. He drew up legal documents that would ensure Beatrice inherited everything if something happened to him, despite territorial laws that typically favored male relatives over wives. He transferred additional funds to banks outside the region, creating financial refuges they could access if forced to flee. Most importantly, he began discreetly arming the ranch hands and establishing defensive positions that could protect the buildings and livestock from coordinated attack. The preparations felt like surrendering to inevitability while simultaneously refusing to be caught helpless. They were creating the infrastructure for either victory or strategic retreat, depending on how events unfolded. In December, as the first serious blizzard of the season swept across the valley, they received news that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. A delegation of women from 3 neighboring towns had written to the territorial governor, demanding official intervention in what they termed the Cross situation. The letter, leaked to them by a sympathetic clerk in the territorial office, accused Nathaniel of harboring a woman who represented a supernatural threat to community welfare, and requested legal authority to remove her from the territory. "They're trying to make our marriage a matter of territorial policy," Nathaniel observed as he read the official correspondence. "Turn personal prejudice into legal precedent." "Will the governor listen to them?" Beatrice asked, though her voice carried more curiosity than fear. "Depends on how much political pressure they can generate and how much he values peace over justice," Nathaniel replied honestly. "But the fact that they've gone this far means they're planning something bigger than social pressure and economic boycotts." The answer came 2 weeks later, when Sheriff Coleman rode out through the snow with news that would force them to make final decisions about their future in the territory. His face was grim with the burden of information he'd rather not deliver. "Nathaniel, I need to warn you about what's coming," he said without preamble, accepting the hot coffee Mrs. Patterson pressed into his freezing hands. "There's going to be a harvest celebration in town come spring. A community gathering to celebrate surviving the winter and pray for good crops. The organizers want to use the occasion to make a public statement about community values and proper Christian behavior." "A statement about us," Beatrice said quietly, understanding immediately what the sheriff was struggling to explain. "They're planning to present the governor's representative with a formal petition demanding your removal from the territory," Coleman confirmed. "But that's not the worst part. Henry Fulton's been speaking at meetings, claiming you bewitched him during your marriage, and that your presence here has caused all the community's recent troubles. Crop failures, livestock deaths, the harsh winter. The revelation that Henry was actively working against them shouldn't have been surprising, but it still felt like betrayal. The man who'd literally buried her in the sand was now trying to destroy the life she'd built from the ashes of his cruelty. They're going to use the celebration as a trial," Nathaniel realized. "Put us on public display and let the crowd decide our fate." "Something like that," Coleman agreed reluctantly. "I'm supposed to serve you with an official summons to appear and answer the charges against Mrs. Cross. I've been putting it off, hoping cooler heads would prevail, but the pressure's getting too intense to ignore." He handed over the legal document with obvious distaste, his duty as sheriff conflicting with his personal sense of justice. The summons was ornately worded but simple in its intent. Beatrice was accused of practicing harmful witchcraft and disrupting community harmony through supernatural means. "This is insane," Nathaniel said flatly. "We're living in 1884, not the Dark Ages." "Scared people do medieval things," Coleman replied. "And this community's been scared for a long time. Bad weather, poor crops, economic uncertainty. They need someone to blame, and you two make convenient targets." As the sheriff prepared to leave, he offered one final piece of advice that carried the weight of genuine concern. "Nathaniel, if you're smart, you'll use the winter to make plans. For leaving, take Mrs. Cross somewhere she can start fresh, where people don't know her history. There are places west of here where nobody cares about old superstitions." But as they watched Coleman ride back toward town through the swirling snow, both Nathaniel and Beatrice knew they wouldn't run. They'd found each other in this valley, built love from the ruins of their separate sorrows, and created something worth defending. The harvest celebration would indeed be a trial, but it would be their chance to speak truth to a community that had chosen fear over compassion. The winter wind howled around the ranch house that night, rattling windows and piling snow against the doors like the gathering forces of opposition that would test everything they'd built together. In the warm circle of lamplight around their kitchen table, surrounded by the ranch family who'd chosen to stand with them, they began planning not for retreat, but for the fight of their lives. Some battles, they'd learned, were worth any cost to win, and some love stories were important enough to risk everything defending, regardless of the odds against them or the price others would demand for the right to happiness. Spring arrived early that year, melting the protective barrier of winter snow and exposing the Cross Ranch to renewed scrutiny from a community that had spent the cold months nurturing grievances like carefully tended fires. The harvest celebration was scheduled for the first warm weekend in April, and as the date approached, the atmosphere throughout the territory grew charged with anticipation and barely suppressed hostility. Nathaniel had made his decision during the long winter nights, sitting by the fire with his father's rifle across his knees, the same weapon that had protected 3 generations of crossmen from threats both human and natural. He would not run from people who mistook cruelty for righteousness, nor would he allow fear to dictate the boundaries of his life with Beatrice. The celebration began on Saturday morning with the arrival of families from across the region, their wagons loaded with food and children, excited by the prospect of rare social gathering. The mood should have been festive, but underneath the surface, pleasantries ran undercurrents of tension that turned neighbors into adversaries and transformed a community event into something resembling a medieval trial. Beatrice had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a simple blue dress that suggested respectability without challenging anyone's preconceptions about proper feminine behavior. She carried herself with quiet dignity as they drove their wagon into town, though Nathaniel could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful way she surveyed the growing crowd. The celebration was centered on the town square, where long tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, and a makeshift platform had been erected for speeches and presentations. Children ran between the adults with the careless joy of youth, unaware that their parents were gathering for purposes that had little to do with celebration and everything to do with judgment. For the first few hours, the event proceeded with forced normalcy. Families shared food and conversation, musicians played familiar tunes, and the territorial representative, a nervous young man named William Preston, made appropriate remarks about community spirit and agricultural prosperity. But as the afternoon wore on and the crowd grew larger, the underlying purpose began to assert itself. Henry Fulton arrived in mid-afternoon, accompanied by a delegation of men from Dustwater, who carried themselves with the self-righteous bearing of people convinced they were doing God's work. Henry had grown thinner during the winter months, his face bearing the hollow look of someone consumed by resentment and alcohol. But his eyes burned with fanatic intensity as he surveyed the crowd, calculating support for the confrontation he'd been orchestrating for months. "There they are," Henry announced loudly, pointing toward Nathaniel and Beatrice with theatrical accusation. "The curse-bringers who've brought misfortune to our decent community." The crowd's attention focused on the couple with uncomfortable intensity, conversations dying as neighbors turned to stare at the pair who'd become symbols of everything wrong with changing times and traditional values under assault. Nathaniel felt Beatrice's hand slip into his own, her fingers steady despite the magnitude of hostility directed toward them. Around them, the ranch hands had positioned themselves strategically. Diego near the wagon, in case retreat became necessary, Tommy and Jake flanking their employers in a show of loyalty that spoke louder than any words. Friends and neighbors, Henry continued, his voice carrying across the square with practiced ease. "We've gathered to celebrate God's bounty and pray for continued blessings on our land. But how can we expect divine favor when we harbor those who mock his natural order?" A murmur of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, though Nathaniel noticed that many faces remained uncertain, caught between social pressure and personal conscience. These were decent people mostly, led astray by fear and superstition, but not entirely lost to reason. "Henry Fulton speaks truth," declared Reverend Marcus from the Dustwater Methodist Church, a thin man with the burning eyes of someone who'd mistaken hatred for holiness. The Lord has sent signs of his displeasure, failed crops, harsh weather, sickness among our livestock. These tribulations began when certain individuals chose to defy his commandments. The accusations built momentum like a gathering storm, each voice adding to the chorus of condemnation that painted Beatrice as a supernatural threat to community welfare. Stories were told of unexplained misfortunes that coincidentally began after her arrival, natural disasters reframed as divine punishment for tolerating the intolerable. But as the verbal assault intensified, something unexpected began to happen. Voices from the crowd started rising in defense. Not many at first, but enough to create cracks in the wall of unanimous hostility Henry had tried to construct. "I've seen Mrs. Cross tend the sick with nothing but kindness and skill," called out Martha Jensen, the schoolteacher whose own barren marriage had never brought similar condemnation. "She saved my nephew's life when he broke his leg, asked nothing in return but gratitude." "Nathaniel Cross has been a good neighbor and fair employer for years," added Frank Morrison, Jake's father, and a man whose judgment carried weight in the community. His character didn't change when he chose to show Christian mercy to a woman in desperate need. The crowd began to fracture along lines of conscience rather than prejudice. Decent people remembering acts of kindness and generosity that contradicted the narrative of supernatural malevolence. The perfect unanimity Henry had counted on was dissolving into the more complex reality of human experience and moral choice. But even as support materialized from unexpected quarters, the confrontation was far from over. Henry's eyes blazed with desperate fury as he realized his carefully orchestrated trial was slipping beyond his control, and desperate men often resorted to desperate measures when words failed to achieve their desired ends. As the crowd's support began to shift toward Nathaniel and Beatrice, Henry Fulton's composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure. The careful mask of righteous community leader fell away to reveal the bitter, violent man who'd buried his wife in the desert for failing to give him children he was incapable of fathering. "You're all being deceived," Henry shouted, his voice rising to near hysteria as he realized his moment of triumph was slipping away. "She's bewitched you with her unnatural healing, turned decent folk against their own neighbors." He reached inside his coat and withdrew a bottle of whiskey, taking a long pull before hurling it to smash against the platform. The sharp sound of breaking glass cut through the crowd's murmuring like a gunshot, creating a moment of stunned silence that Henry filled with increasingly desperate accusations. "I lived with that woman for 5 years," he continued, swaying slightly as alcohol and rage combined to strip away any pretense of civilized behavior. "I know what she is, what she's capable of. She cursed my fields, poisoned my livestock, drove away customers with her evil presence." "The only poison here is your own hatred," Beatrice said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite its gentle tone. "I never cursed anything, Henry. I worked your fields, tended your animals, and tried to be the wife you wanted until you decided I was worthless, because my womb stayed empty." Her calm dignity in the face of his accusations made Henry's rage appear even more irrational by contrast. Several men in the crowd began moving closer to him, recognizing the dangerous instability of a man pushed beyond reason. But Henry wasn't finished. He reached into his coat again, this time withdrawing a pistol that gleamed dully in the afternoon sunlight. The weapon's appearance sent shockwaves through the gathered families, mothers pulling children behind them while men instinctively moved to protect their loved ones. "I should have killed you in the desert instead of letting the community handle it," Henry snarled, raising the gun toward Beatrice with hands that shook from whiskey and fury. "Should have put you down like the rabid animal you are." Nathaniel stepped protectively in front of his wife, his own hand moving toward the rifle he'd carried to the celebration. But before either man could complete their deadly intentions, unexpected voices rose from the crowd, not in support of violence, but in horrified condemnation of Henry's actions. "Put that gun down, you fool!" Sheriff Coleman commanded, pushing through the crowd with his own weapon drawn. "This is a community celebration, not a battlefield." "Henry Fulton, you shame yourself and disgrace this gathering," added Dr. Hamilton, who'd arrived during the afternoon and witnessed the entire confrontation. "Lower your weapon before someone gets hurt." But Henry was beyond reason, his finger tightening on the trigger as years of resentment and failure focused into one moment of violent release. The gun discharged with a sound like thunder, the bullet, intended for Beatrice, striking Nathaniel in the shoulder as he shielded her with his body. The impact spun him around, blood blossoming across his white shirt as he staggered but remained upright. Beatrice caught him as he swayed, her medical training overriding shock as she assessed his injury with quick professional touches. "It's not fatal," she announced to the horrified crowd, her voice steady despite the blood on her hands. "The bullet went clean through, painful but not life-threatening if we stop the bleeding." Henry stared at the gun in his hands, as if surprised to find it there, the reality of what he'd done penetrating his alcohol-fogged mind. Around him, the community that had seemed ready to support his cause now looked at him with disgust and condemnation. "You've shown your true nature now, Henry," called out Reverend Samuel from the Presbyterian Church, a man whose authority rivaled that of his Methodist colleague. "This isn't righteous judgment. This is attempted murder born of jealousy and spite." Sheriff Coleman moved in quickly, disarming Henry and securing him with handcuffs while the crowd pressed closer to see Nathaniel's condition. Dr. Hamilton pushed through to examine the wound, his professional assessment confirming Beatrice's diagnosis. "Mrs. Cross is quite right," he announced loudly. "The wound is clean and will heal properly with good care. Her quick thinking and medical knowledge may have saved her husband's life by keeping him calm and preventing excessive blood loss." As word of the doctor's praise spread through the crowd, the community's perception underwent a fundamental shift. Here was their own physician, a man whose judgment they trusted implicitly, praising the healing skills of the woman they'd been. "Untaught to fear as supernatural threat. I've seen Mrs. Cross's work," Dr. Hamilton continued, addressing the crowd with the authority of medical expertise. "Her knowledge of healing plants and treatment methods is extensive and entirely natural. There's nothing supernatural about herbal medicine practiced with skill and compassion." The petition demanding Beatrice's removal from the territory lay forgotten on the platform as community members came forward to offer assistance and express concern for Nathaniel's welfare. Children who'd been taught to fear the cursed woman watched in fascination as she tended her husband's wound with gentle competence. Henry Fulton sat in the sheriff's wagon, his head in his hands as the magnitude of his actions became clear. The man who'd tried to destroy Beatrice through community pressure had instead revealed himself as the true threat to public safety and moral order. "Will you press charges?" Sheriff Coleman asked Nathaniel as Dr. Hamilton bandaged his shoulder. "I'll leave that to your judgment," Nathaniel replied, wincing slightly as the bandages tightened. A man who shoots unarmed people at community gatherings has made his own case for justice. The harvest celebration had become something entirely different from what anyone had planned. Not a trial of the innocent, but a revelation of truth that would reshape the community's understanding of justice, compassion, and the difference between righteousness and revenge. 6 months after the harvest celebration that had nearly ended in tragedy, the Cross Ranch bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible during the dark winter of their persecution. The morning sun painted the valley in shades of gold and green, illuminating changes that ran far deeper than the seasonal transformation of the landscape. Nathaniel's shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar and the memory of community redemption born from one man's violent desperation. Henry Fulton had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison, his actions having shocked even his former supporters into recognizing the difference between righteous judgment and destructive hatred. The ranch house itself had undergone subtle but significant changes, Margaret's former room now served as a classroom where Beatrice taught reading and writing to children from neighboring families, their parents having overcome superstition, enough to recognize the value of education offered with patience and skill. The walls displayed samples of student work alongside pressed flowers and botanical drawings that illustrated the healing properties of local plants. In the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson hummed contentedly as she prepared lunch for a household that had expanded beyond anything they'd originally planned. 3 orphaned children now called the ranch home, siblings whose parents had died in a winter accident, leaving them with nowhere else to go. 8-year-old Timothy showed promise as a scholar, while his twin sister Catherine possessed an intuitive understanding of horses that impressed even Diego. Their baby brother Michael, barely 2 years old, had attached himself firmly to Beatrice and followed her around the house with the devotion of someone who'd found safety after abandonment. The transformation extended throughout the territory, where Dr. Hamilton had established a regular circuit that brought medical care to isolated communities. Beatrice often accompanied him on these trips, her herbal knowledge complementing his formal training in ways that saved lives and gradually changed attitudes about the intersection of traditional healing and modern medicine. "The Hendersons' baby is thriving," she reported to Nathaniel as she returned from a week-long medical circuit, her saddlebags full of new plants she'd collected for study. "Mrs. Henderson says the tea I prepared stopped her milk fever completely." Such success stories had become commonplace, each healing victory slowly erasing the superstitious fear that had once made her name synonymous with misfortune. Communities that had shunned her now sent requests for her help, and families that had once crossed streets to avoid her presence now sought her advice about everything from difficult births to childhood illnesses. The railroad had finally completed its route through the valley, but not along the path originally surveyed. Beatrice's alternative proposal had proven both practical and profitable, preserving the ranch's essential character while providing the economic benefits of improved transportation. The first train had arrived the previous month, its whistle echoing across the valley like a celebration of progress that honored rather than destroyed the past. Diego approached the house as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, his weathered face creased with the satisfaction of a man who'd watched justice prevail, despite long odds. "The adoption papers came through," he announced, handing Nathaniel an official document that made their expanding family legally binding. Timothy, Catherine, and Michael Cross got a nice ring to it, the legal formalization of what had already become reality in their hearts felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself through acts of love and choice rather than biological accident. They had created family through intention and commitment, proving that the deepest roots grew not from shared blood, but from shared devotion. As evening approached, the ranch family gathered around the dinner table that had been extended twice to accommodate their growing household. The children chattered excitedly about their day's adventures and lessons learned, while the adults exchanged news about crops, cattle, and the steady stream of visitors who came seeking Beatrice's healing knowledge. After the meal, as had become their custom, Nathaniel and Beatrice walked to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same spot where they'd first acknowledged their love for each other. The view remained achingly beautiful, but now it included the railroad tracks that connected them to the wider world and the new buildings that housed families who'd chosen to settle near people they'd come to respect and trust. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel asked as they settled onto the bench he'd built there, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Choosing to fight instead of running away to start fresh somewhere else?" Beatrice leaned against his uninjured shoulder, her hand resting over the place where her simple wedding ring caught starlight. "Never. This is where we found each other, where we learned that love is stronger than fear. Running away would have meant letting them win, letting hatred define the boundaries of our happiness." A gentle pressure against her abdomen reminded her of the miracle that medical knowledge suggested should have been impossible. At 32, After years of believing herself barren, she was carrying the child that had seemed like an impossible dream. Dr. Hamilton attributed it to reduced stress and improved health, but she preferred to think of it as love's final victory over the limitations others had tried to impose on their lives. Our daughter will grow up in a world where being different doesn't mean being worthless, she said softly, her hand moving to cradle the life growing within her. She'll know that family is created through choice and love, not just biology. The ranch spread below them like a testament to the power of persistence and the possibility of redemption. In the distance, lights flickered in the windows of neighboring homes. Families who'd learned to value healing over hatred, community over conformity, and the simple truth that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared with others. They had been buried in separate deserts of despair and abandonment, but they'd clawed their way back to life and found each other in the process. Now their love story had become part of the valley's history, proof that sometimes the most barren ground could nurture the most beautiful growth. The night wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the house behind them, where Timothy was teaching his siblings a song Beatrice had taught him. In a few months, there would be another voice added to that choir, their biological child, joining the family they'd built from choice and commitment. As they rose to return to the warmth of home and family, Beatrice turned for one last look at the stars scattered across the vast sky. Each point of light seemed to represent a possibility, a future unbounded by the limitations others had tried to impose on their capacity for happiness. Love, it turned out, was the most persistent of all growing things, capable of flourishing in the most unlikely soil when tended with patience and protected with courage. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, it rewarded that persistence with harvests beyond your wildest dreams.